Yeah. First, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you and having this opportunity to talk about freedom of expression in the context of the Mohammed cartoons, but also in a more general context of about the status of freedom of expression today, which in fact is in a worse state today than it was, I think, 15 years ago. But we can come back to that. But I think there is a little bit broader context. And in fact, another attack that Boaz didn't mention took place in Copenhagen about a month after the attack on Charlie Hebdo. There was an attack on a public meeting about the right to blasphemy. And the same terrorist in the same day, in the evening, attacked the synagogue in Copenhagen, where there was a bar mitzvah, and one of the security guards was killed. A young man, I think he was only 36 years old. But going back to 2005, it was in fact not just about illustrators or cartoonists. It's true, there was one specific case in Denmark at the time. A children's writer was writing a book about the life of the Prophet Mohammed. And in Denmark, as in Israel, as in most countries in the world, when you publish a children's book, it's very difficult to do it without illustrations of the main character.
Right.
So this writer had written this book, and he went public in the fall of 2005, in August, in fact, saying, you know, I wrote this book, but I had big difficulties finding an illustrator, and some illustrators turned down my offer. And the one who finally said yes and took on the job insisted on anonymity. Anonymity is a form of self-censorship. You are afraid of appearing under your own name because of what might happen to you. I knew dissidents in the former Soviet Union, writers who also wrote under pseudonyms because they didn't want to appear under their own name. In fact, one of the best known dissident writers in the Soviet Union was Andrei Sinyavsky, who was sentenced to 5 years in jail, but he published his writing under the name of Abram Terz. But the KGB figured out who he was, and he was arrested and sentenced. And I had spent time in the Soviet Union as a student. I'm a student of the Soviet Union and Russian culture. And this example of self-censorship rang a bell with me. And reminded me of the way self-censorship had crippled Russian culture and cultures in the former Soviet Union. But there was a debate about this in Denmark. And I think all big Danish newspapers had these cartoons or illustrations on the front page or in the paper, illustrating this book with an anonymous illustrator. And this illustrator, in fact, acknowledged that the reason for his anonymity was fear. And he specifically referred to the fate of Theo van Gogh, whom Boaz named in his introduction, who was killed on the streets of Amsterdam in 2004 because he had made a movie focusing on the justification for violence against women in the Quran. And he was killed. And he also referred to Salman Rushdie, who in 1989 published the Satanic Verses, who caused who triggered a death sentence from Ayatollah Khomeini, and Rushdie for many years had to live in hiding because of that novel. So that was the immediate context, mm-hmm. and that's why I commissioned those cartoons, and you can say at the time we had two questions. Is there self-censorship? Because some people were saying, oh, it's just one case. No, there is no self-censorship. And even this children's writer, this was just a media stunt to promote his book. It's not real. And on the other hand, you had people who were saying, well, there is self-censorship and it is a real problem. So that was one question. Is there self-censorship or not? And the other question was, if there is self-censorship, is that self-censorship based in a in reality, or is it just a fact of the imagination of these illustrators? And that's why I commissioned the cartoons, but we didn't publish them immediately because we had an internal debate about is this just a single case or is there a broader trend? And while we were having this debate, we had a case with the Tate Museum, the Tate Gallery in London, where a conceptual artist had an installation exhibited, a copy of the Talmud, the Bible, and the Quran. And after the 7/7 bombings in London in July 2005, the director of the museum just removed this installation from the exhibition without asking the artist and without asking the curator, and even without asking the police if they identified any danger. So that was a second example of self-censorship. And there was a similar case in Gothenburg, Sweden, with the World Museum. There was a painting done by a female Algerian artist depicting a man and a woman having sex. And on top of the painting was the first verse from the Quran. And angry Muslims complained to the museum, and the director just took down the painting without asking the artist and the curator. So then you had a second example, or third example of self-censorship. And then Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whom Boaz also mentioned, a Somalia-born former Dutch politician who was very critical of Islam. One of her books was published in several European languages, and many of the publishers didn't mention the name of the translator. And the Finnish publisher even removed a critical sentence about the Prophet Mohammed without asking Ayaan. That was direct censorship combined with self-censorship. And in Denmark, you had a stand-up comedian who said, you know, in an interview with the newspaper where I used to work, I'm not afraid of, sorry for my language, but it's a quote, I'm not afraid of pissing on the Bible in front of a camera, but I'm afraid of doing the same thing with the Quran, and it annoys me. So he was making a distinction between Christianity and Islam when it comes to satire due to fear. And finally, you had two imams in Denmark who, after a meeting with the Danish prime minister, called on the Danish government to criminalize criticism of Islam. That was a direct call for censorship, for using the tools of state power to ban a specific point of view in the public domain. And all these things happened within, you know, 1 or 2 weeks, and it convinced me and the newspaper that this was just not a single case, that this was part of a broader pattern that in fact had to do with self-censorship when it comes to dealing with Islam. And that's why we finally published, you know, this page with 12 cartoons. Not all of them are even not cartoons. There are some neutral illustrations, one of the Prophet walking in the desert. There are cartoons making fun of my newspaper. There's a cartoon making fun of the writer who initiated this public debate. So there was no issue of demonization or stereotyping. It was a very diverse collection of cartoons. But we published and nothing happened. You know, the first week or two, and then Danish Muslims started to complain, and 3 months later, after an international campaign where these Danish imams traveled to Cairo, to Beirut, to Damascus, and finally to Mecca to stir up international public opinion, it became, a global story with a lot of pressure on my newspaper and on the Danish government. And it's still, I still live with security guards 15 years later. I cannot go anywhere without being in the company of security guards, which is very strange. I used to be a war correspondent or foreign correspondent. I covered the beginning of the Afghan war in 2001. I've been to Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, all kinds of places where people have been killed in the line of fire. And one of the reasons I decided to go back to Denmark in 2004, after having spent 14 years abroad, was to live a more, quiet and comfortable life. I never imagined that in Denmark, one of the most peaceful countries in the world, that I would need to walk around with bodyguards. It's really mind-boggling.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so I will ask you also, what do you think are the main mistakes which led to the fact that a decade after the publication, the events were not dealt with in a way that would prevent the attack on Charlie Hebdo newspaper in France, the murder of the newspaper editorial staff?
Yeah, I think the fundamental problem back in 2006, when this was a global crisis, was that so few newspapers in the West, in fact, republished the cartoons. And today in Europe, Charlie Hebdo is the only newspaper who is publishing cartoons of the Prophet Mohammed. And I think that the cartoonists at Charlie Hebdo, they would still have been alive. They would not have been killed if all newspapers in Europe or in the United States, in the Western world, had published those cartoons back then. Because you can go after one magazine like Charlie Hebdo when they are alone, but if everybody is insisting on the right to publish something that is in the news, even though I acknowledge that it's offensive to not all Muslims, but to a lot of Muslims, that in fact created this situation for Charlie Hebdo where they were targeted exclusively. And so I think that's the main lesson and in fact it was the same when I lived in the Soviet Union. When you had writers or petitions, the more people who would sign a petition, the more difficult it would be for the KGB to, you can maybe arrest 10 people, but you cannot arrest 1 million people. You see it in Belarus right now, where you have hundreds and thousands of people in the street. Yes, some people are being arrested, but you cannot stop this movement if the majority of the population joins in. So that's the way to fight this kind of fear, I think. And then some people are saying, well, we don't want to offend our readers, and we do not support this initiative. And that's fine. I mean, that's fine, because publication does not mean endorsement. I mean, I will not, put my head on the block and say that I like every one of those 12 cartoons, or that I support the content it's expressing. But if you disagree with what's in the news, then you can write an editorial, and then you treat your readers as grown-ups who can make a decision for themselves what to think about it. And one of the problems back in 2006 was I received a lot of emails from people who were saying, especially in the United States, no newspapers here are publishing your cartoons. Can you please send us a link so we can see them? And then I sent a link, and I would get a response, oh, is it just that? So by not publishing the media were creating an impression that these cartoons are really, really offensive and out of, you know, bounds of what's normal. So I think the main problem back then was that so few media, in fact, dared to show the cartoons to their readers and viewers, and that's the way Charlie Hebdo ended up in this marginalized and tragic situation.
Okay, and today you are a lecturer and an author. You published a few books. Are you still affected by the events until now?
Yes, I am. As I said, I still live with security. Every time I leave my house, I'm accompanied by bodyguards. Every time in Denmark or other European countries, when I appear at a public event, it's sometimes like, you know, a military operation. A lot of I mean, you're used to that in Israel, I know, but we're not used to that in Denmark. With a lot of, you know, armed officers. Everybody has to go through metal detectors and things like that. And of course, it has also affected my, you know, my job opportunities in the sense that, you know, people may invite me once, but when they see what it involves in terms of dialogue with the police and that their premises, you know, are turned into some kind of military field, they say, well, it was very interesting listening to you. It was great, but we don't think we will invite you back.
I can testify for that. When we invited Fleming to the Israeli Freedom Conference this year, that was cancelled due to the corona, but we had to, of course, start connecting the Danish Secret Service with the hotel and with everybody else and to check and so on. And but this is, of course, a special case that I'm happy to do everything that needed, and I'm looking forward for the next invitation when we'll be in the post-corona times that will come, better times that will come. But this is for sure.
In fact, I spoke at the University of Jerusalem, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, I think in 2007. Ephraim Halevi, the former Mossad director, invited me.
Yeah.
And that was a civilized discussion. I mean, there were demonstrations in front of the university, but nobody tried to shut me down or commit violence or threaten me or anything else.
Yeah. Even though I cannot say that Israel is oasis of free speech, and we know that in regard to cartoon, for example, we had a very radical case of Tatiana Soskin that drew Mohammed as a pig and after a criminal prosecution had to spend 2 years in prison while in the same time, the same cartoon with different name, instead of Mohammed, somebody put on it Ariel Sharon, was hanging in a gallery in Tel Aviv, and then it was a celebration of joy and love to the artist. But of course, there is it's a complex issue that was also, it was spread around Hebron in order to arouse riot in a way, so it was a complex situation. However, I know that it's not that we are free to say everything, and censorship is getting even stronger.
I agree with that.
Maybe Tal that joined us, Tal Heinrich from New York, will give us some account of the situation in the States, and will connect it to the situation today. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I'll take it away. Hi, everyone. So as you know, when you think about freedom of speech, freedom of expression in the United States, you immediately think about the First Amendment, and then you see what's happening over the recent period and in a sense with the cancel culture and everything, and I'm sure you guys are following the developments, and this feels like un-American. I don't know if you saw, but because Fleming is from the Cato Institute, so I will share some statistics from a recent survey that the Cato Institute has conducted. And they found that self-censorship, something that Fleming also mentioned, is on the rise in the United States. Listen to this. 62% of Americans say that the political climate these days prevents them from saying things that they believe in because others might find it offensive. But there are some groups who still feel free to speak out their minds. And who are they? According to the survey, strong liberals stand out as the only political group who feel they can express themselves freely. So nearly 6 in 10 staunch liberals feel that they can say what they believe. That's 58%. On the contrary, who do you think, which groups feel that they have to self-censor as part of the political and social atmosphere in the country? You have 52% of centrist liberals, 64% of moderates, and 77% of conservatives. And I see it in I mean, you know me, you know where I stand economically, socially, on social issues, and I stand more with the conservative side of the political map here in the U.S. And I have some conservative friends, and I do see how sometimes we have to self-censor. Especially if you're looking for a job nowadays during the coronavirus pandemic. I come from the media industry, and I see my conservative friends from the media who are right now in between positions or just in general, they are scared to even like certain tweets or certain posts on Facebook or Twitter, because they don't want any recruiter to go over their social media history and see that they liked tweets from President Trump and whatever. And of course that on the liberal side, the parallel side of the political map, then that's not really a problem. So the media has a lot to contribute to that. I think it trickles down first and foremost from the academy. Then you see it trickling down to the media, and from there, the media nowadays is not really. And I know you're having these discussions also in Israel, but in the U.S. you have a lot of opinion shows. News are not really news in the sense that we used to know them. Let's say 20 years ago, 15 years ago. It's more of opinion. And the media is shaping the narrative, and sometimes creating a false image of reality, or twisted, I would say, maybe not completely false, but in their decision of what to cover, how to cover, why to cover, let's say, certain crimes more than others. They create a different reality in the minds of people, and then it's really difficult to go against this narrative. If you go against this narrative, then you are, I don't know, a bigot, a racist, a traitor, whatever. Just find a word. And in the academy, I also have some numbers which are really fascinating. Listen to this. For every conservative professor, again, we're talking about U.S. universities, U.S. academy. For every conservative professor, there are almost 5 liberal professors. For every conservative student, there are 2 liberal students. But in the population, you have the ratio is reversed, which means that the academy does not reflect what's happening in society, because in society it's almost 2-to-1 conservatives versus 2 liberals, which is also interesting. So these are just the numbers that I thought of. Now you also have the censorship on social media. One would think that social media would, the tools that we have today, it's the ultimate tool for freedom of expression. Everyone can say what they want, what they feel, but then it is true to a sense, but not really. The things that are being censored on Twitter especially I would have never ever imagined if some of you are familiar with a professor, he's liberal actually, his name is Brett Weinstein. And he recently came up with a project that he calls Unity 2020. He has this very radical idea of having a unity government in the US. Not that, he just floated out this idea. And his idea is that, there will be a conservative and a liberal governing together. And both of them have to be moderate. He thinks that, in 2020, this is what we need. So he was trying to, gain some traction on social media, and somehow Twitter censored I don't know why, even the unity idea, because Brett Weinstein is controversial. I mean, he's not, if you know him, he's not controversial at all, but he is considered to be a very strong advocate of free speech. And I think that nowadays protecting his liberal values have become being a conservative. So you can imagine who are the people complaining about the content that he posts. Somehow unity is a radical thing on social media. So this is why President Trump, as you know, calls this the silent majority, because there are so many people who feel more likely on the conservative side of the political map, who feel that they have to self-censor. We will see come November if there is really a silent majority in this country, people who can't speak out and say that they are going to vote for President Trump for fears that they are going to be excluded from, I don't know, their family, their friends. People will have issues with them at work. So we will see in November if the silent majority really exists. But another thing that I want to say, I will just give you, I think I will finish with this and then we'll continue with Fleming, and I wonder what he has to say about this. The way to create censorship, or the way to delegitimize a certain way of speech, is sometimes in disguise. It's in disguise. It comes in disguise of, non-divisive language. And I'll give you some examples. This is what some people, I think, don't understand. In my opinion, people still don't understand what happened here in 2016. When you go on social media, you see two different Americas. There's an America that thinks that President Trump is the most divisive president ever, due to his rhetoric, due to, his actions, but mainly his rhetoric. And then half this country sees Trump as a result, as a reaction to a divisiveness that started before. So it depends what side of the political aisle you're coming from. If many conservatives, for example, and this is something that many liberals in the US just simply can't wrap their thoughts around. They never saw 8 years of the Obama presidency, with the PC, the political correctness trends as divisive ones. They thought this was unity, this was inclusive. We accepted everyone, so, and they just simply, in my personal opinion, I think they still do not understand that those 8 years of, political correctness is an impediment to free speech, because you can't speak against it. If you speak against it, then you know what you are. Just complete the sentence. So some people don't see these years as years of division. They saw them as unity, and they simply don't understand how come others do not consider Trump to be as divisive, because they think division started with him. When you can actually create divisiveness and limit the freedom of speech by using, how do I say it, unity and inclusiveness in disguise. I mean, or as a cover to limiting freedom of speech. I'll give you some examples. Let's say if you say that the pro-life movement, if you're, the people against abortions in the US are part of a war on women, then you delegitimize everything that they have to say, because you said, that's it. They declared a war on women. They are against women. They are, you know, so there's no dialogue there. And that's what happened here. If you understand my, the way I'm trying to put it out.
Okay. Fleming, if you have some thought about it, or I may add some elements here, I think that we need to put the line and the clear line between action and thought, which means against a threat of violence, terrorism, let's say when somebody doesn't want to hire you, it's an issue, but it's not the same as threatening your life and livelihood by either a government or by a foreign government or by some terrorist group. So this is something we need to make a clear line, because we tend to involve private companies that have their own, let's say, agenda. Even if you don't like it, you can take Facebook or YouTube and so on, but we shouldn't compare them to a violent player. Because basically they respond to the market, you know. So we have a dialogue with the people and with the common notion of what is allowed and what is not allowed, and we need to convince in order to win the argument. It's not the case of gun. As long as we are free to speak and there is no gun facing us, we are still free, even though we think that there is some unjust,
to what we say.
Yeah, exactly, or some unjust situation. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you, Tal. I think you raise a lot of important points here and issues that needs to be talked about. I saw that I had a question here about my bodyguards, who is paying for them. So let me answer that first. The Danish government is paying for my security, and I'm of course very grateful for that. I would not be able to cover those expenses out of my own pocket. So that was an answer to the question. I think Tal mentioned the First Amendment, and the First Amendment deals with the government. It's about preventing the government from censoring and interfering with free speech. And Boaz is right that Facebook, Twitter, Google, they are private companies, and therefore it's not a First Amendment issue. It doesn't mean that it's not a free speech issue. It is, I think, and especially because some of these companies are so powerful, and a lot of public exchange and speech take place on these platforms. So they had to somehow deal with this issue as well. But I think it's important here to distinguish between law and culture. United States has the best protection of speech in the world, by the way, of the First Amendment. From a point of view of law, you are allowed to say and speak freely than in any other country in the world. The United States don't have hate speech laws like Israel, Denmark, and all other countries in the world. And I'm a big fan of the First Amendment, but without a culture of free speech, the First Amendment will not bring you that far. And I think right now the United States and a lot of other countries in the Western world experiences a crisis of a culture of free speech that might be triggered by the digital world, quite similar to the invention of the printing press in the 1500s that triggered wars of religion and burning of witches and all kind of conspiracy theories, because suddenly new people were allowed to enter the public conversation, and it was possible to distribute words in a way that hadn't happened before. And I think we're living through a similar moment right now. And the key for me to a culture of free speech is this concept of tolerance. That is, that you are able to live with things that you hate, that you are able to live with things, with speech that you hate, without trying to ban it, intimidate, threaten, or use violence. That is very unpleasant. I mean, when people are saying things I don't like, my instinct reaction is either to switch off the television, or leave the room, or ask people to shut up, or but it speaks to the point that freedom of expression by its nature is a very radical idea, and it's the exception and not the rule. Tolerance and freedom, we're not born tolerant and with a gene, to be good Democrats. People don't like to be exposed to ideas that they find abhorrible. So we need a culture of free speech, and because the freedom of expression and tolerance in so many ways go against human nature, we need to cultivate it. Without practice, without a culture, without education, it's very difficult to create a culture of free speech. Of course, the law is very important. It's very important, and law is in fact a codification of norms existing in society. But if norms are being undermined, like it is happening right now in the United States with this polarization, and you have a president who won an election, but for the past 4 years, the opposition have tried to delegitimize him with all kinds of initiatives. I mean, that's the way that's the way political systems operate in the former Soviet Union, where former presidents end up in jail or are being, prosecuted or exiled, or I don't know. I think I'm very concerned about what is going on in the United States, and I think one of the key problems is this lack or undermining of a culture of free speech. And cancel culture is just the latest development. It's this diversity cult, identity politics, political correctness, multiculturalism. They are all part of an ideology that is undermining freedom of expression and tolerance. It's strategies and concepts that are being invoked to censor people, to make them shut up. And I think for free speech to thrive and blossom, I think the key is individual courage. Like my friends at Charlie Hebdo exercised back then. Without courage, freedom of expression will not survive, because there will always be people out there who would like to silence you through, threats, violence, and intimidation. And I mean, you're living in Israel. You are living with the threat of terrorism every day. And I think that the best and most effective weapon against terrorism is to not let the terrorist terrorize you. And that's why the fight against terrorism is not only a job for the police, security service, and the army. It's also a job for individuals and the population, because the goal of terrorism is to create fear and intimidate you to behave in a specific way. And if you refuse to play their game, they will be turned into simple criminals and not exercise the same kind of power over our souls and minds that they want to. So I think the key to freedom, in fact, is courage. Without the courage to challenge, speech ideas that you don't like, you don't get very far. The problem is that you cannot criticize people for not being courageous, because you cannot ask people to sacrifice their lives, for an idea or speech that you want to defend. But I will not do that. I'm not criticizing newspapers who are not publishing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, because people have in fact been killed. But I'm just saying, if you don't do it, it will come at a price. Freedom was never a free lunch. I mean, if you look back at history, people have sacrificed themselves for the idea of freedom. We are just used to the fact that it is free, and we don't have to pay a price for it because our predecessors, fought the battles that we are now enjoying the fruits of. But freedom is not free. It comes at a price, and if there are not enough people who are willing to pay that price, freedom will disappear.
I see that if we can move maybe to the Q&A, I see that Tani wanted to ask something. And Tani, if you feel like explaining your question, go ahead. Tani is from London, so we are pleased to have this international network within our meeting. So please go ahead, Tani.
Yeah, I'm from London, but my English is not so amazing, so please.
From Israel, okay.
Anyway, I have a question about private companies like YouTube. YouTube is a private company, so does they have the right to close channel or to say that they don't like your idea? This was the question.
Yeah, do you want me to answer it?
Yeah, please.
Yes, yes, they do. I mean, it is a private company. It's not the government, so they can do whatever they want. And if you have followed these, the development of the digital platforms, you know that Facebook created an oversight board, a so-called Supreme Court. That is, of course, not a Supreme Court, but it's intended as an independent body of well-respected people to make decisions on the governing rules, or the rules of governing speech on Facebook. We'll have to see how this play out. My own concern is, I mean, I think there are two big problems with these platforms when it comes to freedom of expression. It's a definition of hate speech, and it's fake news. And there is a lot of pressure in societies to compel the companies to take down hate speech and fake news. The problem is that one man's hate speech is another man's poetry. So it's impossible, in fact, to come up with a clear definition of hate speech, and the same with fake news. I mean, according to the law in the United States, you cannot. Lies, as long as they are not defamation and libel, it's protected speech. And my feeling is that we are living through a moment of moral panic, and at a time of moral panics, people tend to overreact, and there is a pressure for banning more speech. So my concern is that these platforms will enforce rules that just take down a lot of legal speech, because they are under pressure from the left and the right, and they have different definitions of what needs to be taken down. And I think you risk ending up in a situation where you will have the heckler's veto, that the people and voices who are screaming loudest and putting most pressure on these digital platforms will have their way. And that's not a fair or democratic solution to a real problem.
If I can, because I don't mind about the fake news, because what is fake news? So my problem is, or my question is, if I have my own, if I'm a journalist and I have a newspaper, I can select which writer will write on my news, because if they write maybe lies or something like that, maybe someone sue me. But on YouTube, because it's a platform like a public forum, so maybe in this case, nobody can sue YouTube because they become like a forum. So they get protect from the government, from the law. But New York Times can be sued by people because it is a publisher. So if you are a forum like YouTube, so you don't allow to close some YouTube, if you understand my point. Or if
are you criticizing or defending Google or YouTube?
I'm asking because YouTube get a defense, a protection from the government, from the law about you cannot sue YouTube.
Yeah, okay. I think I understand your question now. Yes,
but if you cannot sue them, so they cannot, or they can be selective about which.
You can sue them, but only if it is YouTube that speaks. And it's in fact the same with the New York Times. I think there is a confusion and misunderstanding that the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal are being treated differently than Facebook, Google, or Twitter. That's not the case. They are in fact being treated in a similar way. It's about Section 230 in the Communication and Decency Act from, I think, 1996 or 95 that doesn't put liability on these platforms when they publish third-party content. So it's, if you and I have a YouTube channel, it's you and I who are speaking, and then YouTube is not responsible. But it's the same with the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal in the digital world. If I publish an op-ed in the New York Times or in the Wall Street Journal with libel accusations, the New York Times will not be prosecuted. I will be prosecuted. And it's the same on YouTube and Facebook. There is the same protection for speech on a digital platform like YouTube and Facebook, and a digital media like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. There's no difference. So I think there is a misunderstanding here, and I think it's due to the fact that the old media don't like digital platforms, and they are looking at the digital world through the lens of old media, and therefore they quite often get a lot of things wrong. But there is no difference in the digital world between these two kind of media.
Thank you.
Okay, so basically, I want to add another element in regard to the radicalization of the situation in the States and in other places. Beside better defining the concept of freedom of speech, we also need to define the concept of human rights and the limitation on infringement on our rights. Because, for example, I could be much more, I would say, much more relaxed in regard to a speech that I don't like at all, because I know it will never arrive to the parliament and into enacting of a laws that will decide that my marriage are not legal anymore, for example. Yeah, but when we live in a world that everything goes, when every group that pushes certain agenda can make the most outrageous idea into a law that will force all the other to comply, this what bring the, I would say, the emotion high, because people are fighting for their life and they cannot tolerate something that they are fear will lead to diminishing of their freedom or their way of life and so on. So we are constantly under threat because we don't have the basic protection of our human basic rights. And I think that the correction of the situation need to start deeper on the level of human rights, acknowledging of what you should be protected in regard to government infringement. And when we'll have this protection, we can relax and leave politics. I mean, many people have much better things to do than deal with politics, but sometimes we have to, because otherwise we'll pay dearly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're not interested in politics, then politics will get interested in you.
Yeah, this is the situation, because we don't have these borders.
Yeah. But I think, I mean, speaking about human rights, it also depends on how do you define human
True.
rights. And one of the problems with international human rights law and human rights treaties is this inflation and broadening of rights. To me, the key rights are the political and civil rights, but within the UN and the international human rights law system, it's also social and economic rights.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There is a pressure for environmental rights and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I prefer, the term civil rights. And I think it is a problem. But I mean, as I said, freedom depends on the individuals who are living in a society. But I think you are putting your finger on a weak spot in our democracies, Boaz.
Yeah, I think that basically there is two traditions of human rights. There is what's called the natural rights, which are or so-called negative rights, and the positive one that actually can breed any rights that you want and infringe on any other according to the ruling gang. So, and we are living in the age of ruling of the second type of rights, and this is why we will have to suffer this kind of violence and political violence. And just the other day, yesterday, a person that used to be the deputy chief of the Israeli armed force of the IDF, and now is a politician in Meretz party that was supposed to be pluralist, leftist party, wrote a letter requesting to fire two publicists from the Israeli IDF radio because they say something he didn't like about him, and they degraded his honor or something like that. So we are this thing are taken for granted as possibilities in Israel. Few years ago, some other politician joined together and wanted to ban the publication of Israel Hayom in Israel, and so on. So we are in a bad shape in this respect, or in respecting the concept that Voltaire...
May I ask a question? I mean, does this former IDF commander, does he have a legal case, or is this just a question of culture?
No, he didn't approach any legal action. He just wrote a letter to the chief of staff and to the Ministry of Defense, asking to fire them from... Basically, we have an anomaly in Israel. We have the army running one of the most successful radio station. So they're in a strange situation that this station behave like almost a normal outlet of news, and the interviewing politicians and so on. And they have also a program that concern with current issues from individual perspective of the broadcasters. They are type of let's say, publicists that give their opinion, and they said that they didn't like him from different reasons. So this was enough for him to ask for them to be fired. So I see people don't seem to see it. In Israel also there is a lot of sympathy to the Holocaust denial laws in Germany, in other places in Europe and so on. They don't see the principle, and it's very difficult for us today to see through principle, to see through the fog, to see the principle behind, because we never taught to learn in principles. But so we have a lot of education work to do.
I can tell you an anecdote about that. In fact, when I spoke in Israel, I think it was back in 2007, at the Hebrew University, there was a closed meeting, and in the audience there was a very famous Israeli judge and professor of law who was in fact in play for a spot at the Israeli Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
And in my speech, I spoke for or argued for the abolition of Holocaust denial laws, and I tried to make the point that for a minority, in fact, even though it was intended to protect, just takes another majority to turn these laws against the victims. And there was no support for that idea in the audience. But after my speech, then this professor of law and candidate to the Israeli Supreme Court came up to me and said, you know, I think you have a point. And I said, well, why didn't you say it during the debate? Well,
I won the position.
Because it was controversial and unpopular, and I think I think it's really a lack of culture what this IDF chief said, and to me, one of the hallmarks of a culture of free speech is the ability to create space for dissent. Yeah. And fight conformism. And I think dissent, even when people are saying something stupid, outrageous, it's of value because it forces us to think, you know, up against these shared dogmas and ideas.
Yeah. We need to remember that if animals and other life forms are supported by a natural evolution, and in order to be fit to live in reality, human beings are rational animals, and they are supported by development of ideas. And the only way for us to grow is to give room to controversial ideas, to opposing views, and to open discussion. This is our method of livelihood, of understanding reality, of growing, of flourishing. Mm-hmm. So this is one important aspect of it, and we need to protect it if we want to be prosperous and have a good life. Absolutely. So I think that in these notes, unless you want to add anything or if there is any other question, we can conclude the meeting. So it's up to you for a final words for this meeting, not final for the future.
I think Tal said something very important by referring to this Cato Institute survey that 62% of people who are considering themselves conservatives are afraid of speaking their mind. And
77% of conservatives. 62 is the number of people in all society.
Exactly.
Yeah, so 77% of conservatives. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, an astounding figure. It's really mind-boggling. But to make a connection to the beginning of our conversation with the Mohammed cartoons that, in fact, were commissioned as part of the debate about self-censorship, which is now so widespread in the US. I think I may want to conclude with a few words about the concept of self-censorship, because a lot of people, back then said to me, well, self-censorship isn't bad because we need to be able to live together. If everybody just say what they think, then hell will break loose. And that's true in a sense. But I think there is a fundamental difference between what I will call, good manners and etiquette and self-censorship. I mean, self-censorship is basically you would like to say something, but you are not saying it because you're afraid of what might happen to you if you say it. And the problem with self-censorship is that it is invisible. If people are not honest about self-censoring, they can come up with all kinds of good explanations for not saying anything. They will say we don't want to offend. If it's about the cartoons, we don't publish them because we know what they look like. But then you have to say we also know what Donald Trump looks like, or Benjamin Netanyahu. But every time there is a story about them, we publish a photo. So that can be the reason. Of course, it's fear, but it's not very courageous to say you are afraid and that you are not speaking out because of fear. And in that sense, I think self-censorship is it's a kind of spiritual corruption where you are not only being oppressed, but you are oppressing yourself, and you are not only being censored, but you are censoring yourself. And you are not only, being surveilled, but you are surveilling yourself. So it's a very self-destructive kind of activity, and we can only have a conversation about it if we are honest. Otherwise, we can't see it, and that's why it's very difficult to fight self-censorship, because it's invisible, and people tend to be dishonest about their motives for self-censorship.
Okay, so thank you so much, and I hope that we'll see you soon in Israel, in a tour in Israel, and in our next post-Corona conference. And thank you, everybody that joined us.
Thank you, Boaz, and thank you, Fleming. It was really, really nice talking to you. Take care.
Thank you. Yeah. It was great speaking to you. Have a good evening.
Have a good evening. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.